Namaskar, good evening. First, I would like to acknowledge that I am sitting here today on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nations, and I'm grateful for that. Hello, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Supriya Bhattacharya. I am the current president of the Lower Mainland Bengali Cultural Society. It's a not-for-profit organization which was established 43 years ago. We promote and preserve Bengali culture in the Lower Mainland area. Tonight's session is the fourth in a series of 5 webinars. Before I introduce you with the moderator, I would like to just say thanks to Dr. Bhaskar Bhattacharya, the Vice President, who is taking care of who is the host of this webinar, and Dr. Otri Chatterjee, he's going to assist Bhaskar. There is the Otri and Bhaskar. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Tirthankar Bose, one of the founding members of our society, to introduce tonight's.
He just got the link.
Okay, Tirthankar may take 1 or 2 minutes to log in. So please bear with us. All of us are just trying with this new technology, and give us just 1 minute. Okay, Tirthankar will come and introduce Dr. David Curley, who is here with us already. Okay. Did he join Bhaskar?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay.
I called him, he said that he just got it.
There he is, there he is, there he is.
Okay, he's there.
Over to you, Tirthankar. I did my part.
Okay, good. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. David Curley, because it's a personal pleasure also because David has been a very good friend of, a longtime friend of my wife and myself. And let me introduce him properly. Professor David Curley is Professor Emeritus at Western Washington University. He is both a literary critic, student of literature, and a social historian, which is not always a very common profile. And he comes from very, very, how should I say, grand background, having studied at the University of Chicago, which is certainly one of the best, if not the best, centers for Bengal studies. He has also published widely in journals, and he has written a very well-regarded book on Mangal-Kabya. And this is what he's going to talk about tonight. He has great interest in the intersection between literature and social history, which is I assume, David, that's the line you will take tonight. And we are eagerly waiting to hear you. And then I hope you will entertain some questions. So over to you, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Supriya Bhattacharya. My thanks also to Professor Chinmoy Banerjee and to Tirthankar Bose for inviting me to give this lecture to your distinguished webinar. And I'm very pleased and happy to be here with you and have a chance to talk with you. As Tirthankar said, my topic tonight is social history, reading Mangal-Kabya and trying to write social history, which is really what I've tried to do for most of my scholarly life. It's a topic that is, of course, extremely broad, and in a moment I'll try to narrow it down just a little bit. But it's also a topic, I think, that poses certain kinds of challenges or problems. Let me state it in the sort of most extreme way that I can. By the idea of a social history, do we not assume entirely human and this worldly historical explanations? And yet, do not Mangal-Kabya themselves explain by means of divine interventions in human affairs? So what can they tell us about a social history? To answer this sort of question, I want to make a number of points, and let me just put on my share screen and there. Can you see now the slide? I hope.
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, well, wonder why not. Well, I'll go back. Huh. Let me respond in a few different ways. One is, what do we mean? What ought we to mean by religious? Was religious at the time something that was only entirely concerned with the spiritual, that is to say, the otherworldly? I think it's obvious that in all the major religions of South Asia and beyond South Asia, in pre-modern times, that just was not the case. Second, are Mangal-Kabya only concerned with spiritual things? Here again, that is, I think, not the case for at least some Mangal-Kabya. For the more complex ones that I'll be dealing with tonight, certainly. I want to just set out the argument for this rather controversial statement. It has to do with what two scholars call plot functions of these complex texts. One, of course, is the deity who acts in human affairs to arrange for the establishment of her or his worship. But the other plot function belongs to the major human characters. They're, to be sure, sent from heaven on earth to achieve this purpose of the deity, establishment of her or his worship. But they do that through, first of all, suffering a kind of loss or fall from well-being. And then achieving, partly through worship of the deity, a reinstatement into well-being that proves the power of the deity.
Curley, can you just retry the sharing again, please?
Yeah, sure. But in the, let me finish the thought and then I'll do that. But in the nature of the plot of complex Mangal-Kabya, the problems that have to be solved are human problems. They're caused by human failures of character, of family life, of social institutions, of even religious instruction. And so they have to be remedied, not just by the intervention of the deity, but by actions of the human characters themselves. We therefore can read Mangal-Kabya, the complex Mangal-Kabya, not just for religious instruction, but for instruction about what social and political problems looked like to their authors and audiences, and what kinds of human agency were thought to be necessary to solve those human problems, in addition to, alongside of, the intervention of the deity. Now, it's true that to the authors and audiences of Mangal-Kabya, the membrane between human affairs and divine affairs was thin and permeable in a way that it isn't probably for many of us. But with that exception aside, I think Mangal-Kabya provide a wonderful source for writing social history. I've said I want to narrow the topic down a little bit. Today I will be talking mostly about problems that arise from human rulers who by nature have to have the capacity to use military power, and military power which by its nature always has the capacity to be used to oppress subjects as well as to protect and defend them. Maybe this is not so, irrelevant a topic. One last comment about writing social history. From the very beginning, I was relieved that I would be working with texts that are, where the authors are named and dated. So they have not just names and dates, but a kind of lineage, location in space, in social space, and in political space. They name their rulers, usually the rulers of their localities. So that makes them much easier to work with than anonymous texts by multiple authors where you have to kind of sort out exactly who wrote which part and when. With that sort of background, then, I think we can turn to what I'm sure drew you to this lecture, the remarkable stories of Mangal-Kabya. And I want to focus on two of them, Chondi Mongol and Dharma Mongol. Chondi Mongol, you see a pot behind you and the scene of the merchant Srimanto seeing the goddess as Kamala Kamini, a familiar scene to most of you, no doubt. We'll be talking a little bit about this as we proceed along. Have we got, can we try sharing the screen again?
Let's try again because I just restarted the share screen.
Okay.
It should have worked right away.
How's that?
No, have you selected the PowerPoint?
Yeah. Huh. How's that?
No.
Okay, well, it doesn't work.
Worked in the morning.
Yeah, I know. I did the same thing. Well, let me proceed. I don't want to waste time with this.
Okay.
Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. So let me go to my first topic, which is an environmental topic, clearing the forest. I want to suggest that wild forests and lands settled and ruled by humans together define a symbolic landscape in Mangal-Kabya. A forest means a predatory setting, less than fully human. A settled kingdom means a setting where the ethics of being fully human is possible. These two scenes describe as well a frontier and contrasting patterns of actual land use as the agrarian frontier expanded in two different places, one in Western Bengal in the Rar, and one in Eastern Bengal in the southeastern delta and along the coastal plains reaching around to and beyond Chittagong. We may begin with two stories. In the first, found in Mukunda's Chondi Mongol, written towards the end of the 16th century, there was a kingdom of the animals in Biju Forest, a kingdom whose lion king was Chondi's servant. Strong and predatory animals served him as ministers, but they also protected all animals from human hunters. Kalketu was born into an untouchable family of hunters. He was a peerless hunter. He threatened the lives of all of the animals in the forest. And when the Lion King appealed to his goddess Chondi for protection, she intervened, prevented Kalketu's hunting, and commanded him to stop hunting the animals, to clear part of the forest, and to found a settled kingdom, a Rajya, a human settled domain, in which he, the former hunter, would become her agent, Odhikari, and Raja, and the goddess herself would be the divine source of his authority as Raja, as she had been and would continue to be for the Lion King in the kingdom of the animals. Okay? In the second story, found in Mongol texts that were written more than half a century later, a tiger cub was raised from infancy by a well-meaning but foolish local Raja. Grown up, the tiger cub was escaped from his cage and hunted down both domesticated animals and people, and so caused the whole region to be abandoned and to revert to forest. Until defeated by the hero Lao Shen, the tiger literally sat on the abandoned throne of this depopulated domain, but he did not protect. He only ate. In most versions of this story, the goddess had given the tiger a boon, which made him invincible to human weapons. So he had to be killed by extraordinary means in order to restore an island of wild forest to the otherwise universal domain of human rulership. These two Mangal-Kabya episodes then portray a fundamental difference in their conception of forests, of wild animals, and the subjects and limits of goddess Chondi's authority over forests and kingdoms in Chondi Mongol, over animal and human rebels in Dharma Mongol. Now, we know from a series of brilliant works on forests in South Asia and in Bengal that the agrarian frontier was porous. It was not fixed. It moved and people moved across it in both directions. It was thinly populated by people who practiced transhumance as livelihood, clearing a space in the forest, burning it down, planting in the ashes for a year or so, and then moving on to do a new space in the forest. And even in the 19th century, tigers of the forest sometimes made human life so unsafe that whole villages were emptied. Along an agrarian forest frontier, forest people could also move back and forth between living from the resources of the forest and laboring as forest cutters for agrarian settlements. These two versions of the forest and these two destinations, ruler and warrior, displayed by each character, are the result of different paths, and their stories advocate very different ideas about who can become a ruler. Taking them in turn, we can see profound changes as the agrarian frontier in the Rar began to close. So I want to turn back to the longer Chondi Mongol episode and the story of Kalketu, the hunter, and Raja in Chondi Mongol. We've already met him. In all versions of the story, he was a son of Indra, cursed to life on earth, and born into a family of impoverished hunters in order to spread goddess Chondi's worship. To provide Kalketu with an alternative to the sinful livelihood of hunting animals, she commanded him to clear the forest. She had Vishnukarma build him a temple and a palace. At first, Kalketu objected that Brahmins would never take any gifts from him, and so would not settle and perform her worship. She said, "Oh, they will. They certainly will take gifts from you." Well, she was right about that. It's important that he named himself as a Chohar in this objection, and that a Chohar did not mean any tribal identity. Later on, at least, it referred to people who were marginal migrant laborers in Calcutta, people who at the same time retained some connection to an ancient ancestral home in the forest. It means something different here in this text, as we'll see, but I do want to stress that it's not an ethnic identity. Kalketu was given a ring of immense value by the goddess, but the ring didn't become a sacred symbol of his authority as sovereign, one to be carefully preserved. Instead, she told him to sell the ring, and with the money so acquired, buy the things that he needed for a kingdom. And Kalketu did that. The first thing that he bought was the service of accountants, Kayasto accountants, a clever observation and one that's kind of funny. In Mukunda's version, he then proceeded to buy regalia for himself, soldiers, weapons for an army, and stores for his peasants in the first year of their clearing the forest and establishing cultivation. Moreover, he recruited headmen and their peasants by offering them a whole series of terms better than the going rate for being a peasant. He established separate quarters for different kinds of people. And finally, in establishing his kingdom, he set up a tax-free market which would attract foreign, that is to say non-local merchants with their goods. Markets and market-like transactions are literally central to this account of expansion of human settlement on the agrarian frontier. For buying and selling occupies a precarious middle position between the predatory livelihood of hunting and the fully human, generous, and reciprocal gifts that will define relations between Kalketu and his kingdom. I turn now to Dharma-Mongol and to a pair of characters in Dharma-Mongol and to their paths towards different destinations. One of them is a warrior, but not a warrior by birth, a warrior by education and choice, but not by birth. After all, there are no Kshatriya in Bengal. The other is an untouchable hunter, just like Kalketu. In fact, with a very similar name, he is Kalu Dom. And Kalketu sometimes himself is called Kalu as a kind of nickname. So we're meant to compare these two characters and their different destinations. In general, Dharma-Mongol texts criticize Mukunda's emphasis on generosity, harmony, and pacific resolutions to conflict. And we'll see that as we watch these two characters in their function of becoming a Raja and becoming a warrior. The first story I want to note is that when he's just an adolescent, Lao Sen sets out to go see his overlord in order to procure the gift of a kingdom. On the journey, what he has to do is win renown as a warrior. And he does this as he encounters a series of animal and human enemies. One of the enemies is the tiger, whose story we just heard. Another is a wild elephant. But notably in this series, there are two women also. Women who leave us no doubt, or the text leaves us no doubt, about their selfishness, their lust, and their violence. Lao Sen arranges for brutal punishments of these two women. After his victories over them and the animals, Lao Shan presented himself as a celibate warrior youth with renown from these deeds to his sovereign Goreshwar, the overlord of Gore. And as a reward, Goreshwar gave Lao Shan a subordinate little kingdom within his broad domain. A kingdom where Lao Sen would be a Raja, but Goreshwar's minister insisted that this gift would be conditional. It would depend upon Lao Sen's continuing provision of military service on demand. So in Dharma Mongol, being a warrior is necessary to become a Raja. It's necessary because only warriors can be granted subordinate domains to rule, and only on the condition that they will provide military service. Subordinate rulers are required, in language repeated many times, to be true to the salt, that is, to the obligation to give their lives in battle, because they have received from their ruler the necessities of life. We easily can recognize in the idiom of the salt a political context that claimed universal sovereignty for Mughal rule. For Lao Sen, rendering military service, of course, required an army, and he therefore had to recruit soldiers. His most important cohort of soldiers were 12 Dom men led by Kalu Dom, hunters, whom he recruited because of their skill in using weapons. They also were given salaries, lands, and homes in Lao Sen's new kingdom. Dharma Mongol texts teach us that violating the ruler, salt is the way to hell, and that to repay the debt of salt requires willing sacrifice of one's life in service to the ruler, and Doms themselves fall in this relationship of receiving the salt and having to repay it that we have seen Lao Sen in relation to his overseer. I should say just briefly a bit about the Dom's prior livelihood. They lived at the margins between villages and forests. They herded ducks and pigs in the forest. They made baskets out of reeds that they gathered in the forest. They sold these things in the marketplaces. They brewed liquor. And all of these dimensions of their livelihood made them offensive and untouchable to caste Hindus. Lao Sen ignored all of that in taking them into his military service. He just overrode it all as king. He settled them and gave them a new status and new prestige and new prosperity. But despite their rise in status and prestige and prosperity, the Dom men cannot escape their original wildness by nature. In Dharma Mongol stories, Kalu Dom fails to defend Lao Sen's kingdom. He fails because on the crucial night before battle, when he should have been worshiping the goddess, he drank with the other Dom men the liquor to be offered to her. Instead, drank it all down, got so drunk he passed out. His wife had to carry him home. And the next day, she had to go into battle in his place because he was in a stupor, still in bed. You see, we're meant to read this story figuratively, not just literally about the one person, Kalu Dom. This is a statement about all Doms, right? All of them are irretrievably wild. And at the end of the story, unlike Kalketu, Kalu Dom cannot be admitted into heaven because he thinks heaven is going to be a place where he can drink liquor and eat pork. My next topic is scales of agency shared and not shared by men and women. In this section, I focus on heroines in order to discover powers and limits that belong to the agencies of women. I'll focus on Choni Mongol texts because the space that they give women for action is larger and more complex than that given to women in Dharma Mongol texts. Our problems will be to see how women's agencies were related and how they relied on and were limited by women's sexuality. Links between women's agency, beauty, and the observance of modesty codes are beautifully revealed in Choni Mongol texts in a context that reintroduces the theme of hunting and the location of a forest. Indeed, in our first introduction to the merchant family of the second part of this story, we are told that Dhanapoti's senior, his wife, who became his senior wife, was like a tigress, and that when the child bride Kulana, if and when she was married into this household, she would become the deer. Hunting then can invade family relationships. And indeed, as we see the story progress, we watch how Dhanapati is called away on service to his king, is absent for a very long time. The senior co-wife begins to feel very jealous of the beauty of this young girl and decides to ruin it by taking away her luxuries. She drives Kulana out of the household, takes away her fine food, her comfortable bed, gives her the task of herding goats, makes her live in the goat shed, sleep on the ground, takes away all of her ornaments and her silk sari, everything that marks her as the bride of a wealthy family, and gives her instead a short, coarse garment made of flax to wear, one that will not cover her upper body. Outside in the forest herding the goats, she becomes socially invisible, like a beggar woman, like a mad woman. She has no social identity. She's just the lowest of menial servants. And in the forest, at least according to accusations brought against her, she becomes immediately the prey for men who happen upon her, who are also in the forest. In the forest, Kulana learned to worship Chandi. Through worship of her, she was restored home to her home. The elder co-wife was warned by the goddess herself. The merchant was warned by the goddess herself, and he too returned home. And upon his return, Kulana, now dressed in her most beautiful clothing, brings out beautiful gifts to offer to Dhanapati, her husband, as bait, a kind of pleasing gift, attractive, pleasing gift to initiate an exchange in which he in turn will have to listen to her supplication. He does listen. She brings charges against him. She recites the story of her oppression. She makes him a guilty partner in this story by a clever rhetorical device, and she wins his intervention. But it is ultimately her sexuality that gives her the position of being fully a wife. It's important to notice that the last stage of the marriage that had been left undone was sleeping with her husband on the third night of the wedding. And she will do this even though she has not yet had her first menstrual period. Before this can happen, there's another debate, this one between the three, Lahana, Kulana, and Dhanapati, about whether such a thing should be done, should be allowed. Lahana, the senior co-wife, says it should not and brings in again the image of hunting in order to describe what will happen to this young girl. She describes a series of predator-prey relationships, and she says in each case, this is what your lovemaking will be like. It seems to me that there is no doubt that in these texts, a new custom is being debated. Mukunda is coming down heavily on the side of the custom, but his text reveals the opposition, the resistance of at least some women to the imposition of this strange new custom. Some of these agencies of women are fully revealed only in the end of the story when Kulina is again charged with misbehavior. This time the trial goes to Dhanapoti's merchant clan, and they bring charges for their own selfish reasons. They want a kind of penalty, monetary penalty from Dhanapati. She's forced to undergo a series of ordeals that will demonstrate the truth of her otherwise unprovable claim that she never was impure in the forest. And by these ordeals, she eventually wins their shameful confession that they were wrong to accuse her. I note finally, as a statement about, in the way of a conclusion, how many of the agencies of women are shared by men in this story. Not, of course, sexuality, not giving birth, and for women, not going to war. But the whole rest of the series, from offering attractive gifts to supplications, to negotiations between partners, kind of back and forth arguments, bargains with penalties, having to demonstrate the truths of your claim. Upon failing to do that or to be able to do that, having to undergo ordeals. All of these agencies are shared by women and men in these stories. And I think they demonstrate something really crucial about the nature of social ideas in pre-colonial Bengal. It's not a notion of gender roles exactly, because so much is shared. Instead, it's a notion of scales of agency, some of which are not shared between men and women, but a great many are. So on that final note, I will conclude this. We have a time for questions. I'm certainly eager to hear what they are, and I'll just wait to find out what you're thinking about the lecture. I would like to ask you a question to think about, and that is, what can Mangal-Kabya mean for you as readers in your own lives? Is there any way that they are relevant, or are they just a kind of curiosity of the past? So thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Otri, are you there?
Yes.
Are there any questions?
Yes.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
So I'll just unmute. Oh, I think Bhaskarda has to unmute because...
There's a question from Anisha Datta. Anisha, you can ask the question.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Curley. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you for your lovely talk. Very interesting. And I have to share an anecdote. Before I became a sociologist, in grade 11, 12, I believe it was in grade 11 or 12, we had a history of Bengali literature, where a very boring Bengali teacher used to teach us Mangal-Kabya, and I was a science student, and I used to hate that class so much. But later on, when I became interested in social history, sociology, of course, I find it fascinating. So to come to the point, thank you once again for the great talk. My question is, could you kindly shed some light on the caste dynamics of that period in Bengal?
Caste dynamics. Yes, very briefly.
That period, yeah.
Very briefly. I should say that the person who has done the most and the best work about this is Hitesh Sanyal, and I highly recommend his books. He's passed away, and the books were written some time ago, but he is the one who really has used the widest variety of evidence, both literary and non-literary, to assemble a picture of some caste mobility. That is to say, castes were not rigidly defined once and for all. There was the possibility not just for individuals to rise, but for whole groups of families to rise in a caste system. That usually involved a change of occupation, as we've seen today in this lecture, but the change was not only from the position at the margins or outside of village life. Sometimes it was from inside village life, as he points out, and often the destination was not becoming a warrior, certainly not becoming a ruler, but becoming a peasant. And so new peasant jatis did emerge exactly in the period when we see the advancing agrarian frontier in the Chor-Nagpur peneplain up the rivers and into the lower hills before the Chor-Nagpur plateau. So I think that's certainly one example, and he gives also some other examples of people who moved to the destination of being a kind of merchant instead of being an artisan. For example, Tilis versus Telis, whether you ground the seeds or whether you just sold them, also involved a raising in the level of caste for those people who were the seed sellers. So I have to say I'm completely indebted to him, and that's all I really have to say today.
Okay, thank you so much. The interesting point was that mobility was possible.
Yes,
I
yes.
have to take a look at that book. Thank you.
Sure.
Question is from Ghosh K. Please ask your question.
Yeah. Thank you for your lecture. Wonderful. I just came back from Sundarbans and I heard about Mangal-Kabya by before I left from Amitabh Ghosh. He was.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So I asked him what I should read. He asked me to read Precolonial Lit. I'm an economist, but I went there and I'm working on the issue of migration in the Sundarbans.
Yeah.
And looking at gender issues. And I visited many homes and many villages in the Sundarbans. The one thing that I found a ton of literature on the Bon Bibi, Dokhin Raj, and the tiger. And though I found it a little difficult to move through it. And I got the Mangal-Kabya, actually, I got the book. And I do read Bengali, so I can. But it's hard.
It's hard. Yes,
it's hard. It's not easy for me to read this without my training in lit, but or meager training in lit. But what I was thinking is, how did these deities that you speak of as being this, and the humans and the permeable membrane between them so that the agencies are kind of shared almost. How does that translate into the relationship, or if it does at all, into the new relationship that emerges in the Sundarbans or in the delta between the Bon Bibi and Dokhin Raj and the tiger? I just don't know how to research this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to say that I have never read these texts, so I'm not the expert you need to be going to about them. But in general, there seems to be a kind of question about who has ultimate authority over the forest in the Sundarbans. Which deity is it that you really should, or which protector is it that you really should pray to? So there's a Muslim character and a Hindu character.
Yeah.
And they're in a kind of tension with each other. What struck me about reading the text was that in the Bon Bibi text, I didn't see settlers. I saw people who were passing through the forest, or I should say reading about them. I saw people who were passing through the forest. There were woodcutters, for example. There were fishermen. There were various people hunting and gathering in the forest, but they were not settling down to live in the forest. They passed through and they moved out. And that's a very different thing from the kind of question, from the question that arises when you're not just, you know,
Yeah.
entering and leaving, you're really trying to stay there.
Yeah, that's, and I would like to, I don't want to hog the time, but just one anecdote I heard from a 70-year-old man. I met many older people on the boats and who are cooks, etc., and who have lived. But anyway, one older man I talked to, and he said, because we are talking about migration and how difficult it is to live in the Sundarbans and why people should migrate. And there are many people I met, young people who had never left the Sundarbans. They were capable of leaving, but they never left it. And one older gentleman, he said, well, you know, I went to the forest and went for honey. And we have all these rituals to get to gather honey. But I saw a tiger and we locked our eyes. At that, and I didn't get eaten. And at that day I realized I will never leave this place because it is a transformative experience. There is nothing I will ever get in the world that is as real as this. And to hear it from somebody who is semi-literate was, who was not making a big deal out of it, just telling me as it was I just began to kind of wonder, what is the relationship of these people in the forest?
Have you read the scholarship of Anu Jalal?
No, I have not. What's his name?
It's a woman. Maybe I'm pronouncing her name.
That's fine. Anuj.
Incorrectly. If you send me, if you
I'll email
arrange for me to get an email from you, I'll send you the.
Okay, great. Wonderful.
All right.
It's an amazing lecture. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any more questions here.
No more questions. Well, my question is, what do you think of these texts?
Okay.
Are they worth reading or not?
One more question came up just when you are so happy not doing questions. Okay, Archana, please go ahead. Archana, you can ask your question.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk. My question, it struck me that you said that Tilis are sowing to the land of the til seed, and Telis who grind them.
No, I'm sorry if I may have misspoken. The question is whether you just sell them or whether you grind them.
Oh, I misunderstood then.
I may have misstated.
Because I thought that because who do whatever they do, that according to that, their caste is made, like Tilis and Telis, they're two different castes, are they?
The idea is there's a kind of violence to little tiny creatures in grinding the seeds. If you have to do that, just as a hunter, you have to kill animals. It's the same kind of thing. And so your status, your jati status is lower. You are more impure than those people who don't, who just take the ground seeds and sell them.
Boy, thank you very much for clearing, because I would have carried that wrong impression of that caste system.
Are there any more questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Oh, good. I was hoping.
David,
how can a friend not have a question?
David, what exactly is the source of the ruler's power? Is it entirely divinely given? What kind of human effort is involved? What kind of talents would one have to have?
Yes, very good question. And there are different ways to answer I mean, it's an argument about answering these questions, but let's take Dharma Mongol, for example. As Lao Sen grows up, you know, his father is thinking about what kind of education this boy will need in the new dangerous world that we live in now, where some guy, Ichai Ghosh, can just take away my kingdom.
Right.
And he says, he thinks a boy does not just need the education in reading and writing and Sanskrit and so on. That's not going to do it. He needs an education in strength and power. Bal Pratap. How is he going to get that education? He's got to go to school with the wrestlers. And, you know, the best wrestler, we know who that is called in to supervise the education, Hanuman. And he arrives in disguise and teaches Lao Sen the fundamentals of wrestling. So that's one kind of answer.
Mhm.
But notice there's another kind of answer that I think is in response to these texts, and it's criticism of Brahmanical education. And that's in Bharat Chandra's Vidyashundar, where Shundar arrives at the gates of Burdwan, meets the gatekeeper who says, wait a minute, you don't look like a scholar that you claim to be. What's this horse about? What's all these weapons about? What's all this stuff, this regalia? What's the fanciness? You're not a scholar at all. And Shundar says, I am. And the doorkeeper says, well, then give me all this stuff as your tax, and you can go in just with your books. You know, there you get someone who is dressed as a warrior. Of course, he's also a Sanskrit scholar, and a scholar particularly in the science of alankara, that is to say rhetoric. But everything is taken away from him except what he really needs, which is alankara rhetoric. And he can win everything just by his brilliance. So there's a very different kind of story. I don't know of earlier stories other than Bharat Chandra's Vidyashundar, who so clearly set out intellectual achievement as the way to win.
Right.
I think most others say, no, you got to have some skill in the use of power.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. This is another kind of qualification. Lao Sen, you mentioned that he's celibate.
Well, he's celibate except
Right.
for one night.
Celibacy, is that a source of power? The reason, this is a very tricky question, because there is a tradition in certainly Bengali social culture, a kind of idealized culture, that celibacy somehow enhances manliness, which is kind of strange. However, and it enhances manliness by preserving virya and so on, and vijja. And the reason is, I'm interested in this because there is a kind of tracking from those medieval ideas, perhaps ancient ideas, down to certain modern,
Yes. Yeah, sure.
modern idealization of manhood.
Sure. So let me say that I think these stories of Lao Shen borrow on North Indian oral stories about warriors and, various kinds of low status Rajputs in particular and their oral stories. But we have to take seriously the notion of a wrestling education. And certainly wrestlers, for the duration of their education, are required to be celibate.
Mm-hmm.
It's also clear from the texts themselves that during his campaigns, Lao Shen also is required to be celibate. That's clear because there's one night when he fails, when his first wife comes to him and begs him for the chance to have a child since he's going away on this dangerous campaign, warrior's campaign, and may not return. And he decides to give in to her, but that endangers his position as a warrior in that campaign. And it means he cannot win that battle by himself.
Right.
So I think it's taken very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, I also think there are North Indian ideals involved in this, not just Bengali ones.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Great.
Well, I see that we've reached the end of our time. If we've
Oh,
also
just a minute. You are saying that there is one more question, and then I have a question and a comment.
Oh, good.
Otri, is there a question? Otri?
Yes, there is a question. So the question was that what is the difference between social history and religious history?
Social history and religious history. That's a very good question. I have to say that when I started off writing my book, I did not really try to define social. It just seemed like a convenient basket in which to put whatever I found of interest in the text. And I left it pretty much undefined. I would say that there is a kind of possible kinds of differences between what is social and what is cultural, but certainly they are also closely related. I would now try to write a social history that links ideas in texts to the powers and agencies displayed by the authors or the patrons of those texts. And there I think you get to kind of closer link between the social situation of the authors and the cultural production of the text. But it's not a perfect relation, as we know. Authors often don't know exactly what they're doing and go off on their own anyway, and have brilliant ideas quite apart from what their patrons tell them to do. I think that's the case with Mukunda, in fact. And so I think it would be wrong to expect a perfect fit between the two. And in that sense, I want to preserve a kind of independence for literary texts and for reading them as literature as well as signs of social history.
Professor Chinmay Banerjee actually raised his hand once, but he has taken it down. Chinmay, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for a very fascinating lecture. Really, you raised some wonderful ideas. What struck me most was that you were talking about an amazing period of transition, foundational transition. First of all, we are dealing with frontier, the frontier of the forest and the settlement. We are dealing with the beginning of settlement. And so at the frontier, there's this transfer taking place, gradual sort of interpenetration of settlement and the forest and the fluid relationship between them. So the caste relationship that you talk about seems to be the people of the forest people who go into the forest are the lowest. Then they settle down when they become peasants and so forth, they rise in status. And so settlement gives the status. Settlement is the status. So from the marginality of the forest into the up status of the settlement. And then within the settlement, you get hierarchies and so on and so forth. So that I find absolutely fascinating. So we're dealing with really a historical moment when all this is happening. An enormous fluidity, therefore, in the gender relationship and in the abilities and all that you talked about, the fluidity. That is one fascinating idea that struck me, and I'd like to, needs to explore some more on that. And what relevance, and that's very, very relevant today. Today, the whole relationship between the modernity and the indigeneity between the forests, Adivasis,
Mhm.
and the whole sort of modernity and say Indian quote unquote civilization. So that is absolutely pertinent. So this is not past. This is very, very relevant to the situation in India today. The fundamental conflict between the hunting gathering or the marginal Adivasis who live in the forest and the rest of India. So that is one thing that I got away from your lecture. The other thing was the question of legitimation and how a religion here provides a kind of a not only power but legitimation and legitimation of power. And there, the salt thing that you mentioned, basically the foundation of the Jagirdaris, the entire sort of system that comes down to the granting of the Jagirs and the military powers that are sort of established and given land and so forth in exchange for military support, which becomes a kind of equivalent of feudalism elsewhere. So that as you, I think I mean, obviously it's historical. It's obviously coming from the north and in a more established situation. So legitimation, the notion of power, notion of kingship, and the notion of duty also. There's different kinds of duties that are being played out here. One of the most important things that I got here was a duty towards animals, and to the subject, the ruler's responsibility to the subject, to the preservation of the subject, to the well-being of the subjects and the animals. So we're dealing with the relationship of humans and nature, and the responsibility of the ruler to the ruled. So these are all absolutely fundamental political questions. So yes, relevance, this is profoundly relevant. Thank you.
Good. I'm very glad to hear it. I'm not sure I have anything to add to this.
I believe we have one more
Mind.
question. I believe we have one more question.
Please, yours?
Yes, Otri is going to ask.
Okay.
So yeah, so the question is from Mr. Indranil. I have asked Bhaskar to unmute him. Bhaskar, can you go ahead and look at the Q&A box?
I did, and you asked the question, right? There is no
yes, so yes, you can. I would like to request Mr. Indranil to go ahead and ask the question.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead, Indranil.
Oh, you are muted. It's still muted. Sorry. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, Professor Curley, thank you. Thank you for your really great lecture. I really liked it. The question I have is relevant to post-colonial studies. Okay. So, people like Dipesh Chakraborty and others will say that India is a spiritual country and it's not very fruitful to understand India from a social materialist history. Now, I being a student of Christopher Hill and his great book, World Turned Upside Down, where he talked about levelers and the spiritualism and divine history and the material history, I would like to ask you this question, is that how fruitful is a post-colonial studies where the communication between spiritual ideas and material ideas are not connected in a way that we would like to?
Oh, but is it true that they are not connected? Perhaps we read Dipesh slightly differently. in his first book on labor, I thought he brilliantly demonstrated how failure to take account of religious, spiritual ideas of people in the labor movement at different levels, or cultural ideas of people in the labor movement at different levels, made it impossible to understand what was actually going on in unions in the textile industry in 20th century Bengal. So I question a little bit the notion of a separation, where what I would see, and in any case, what I would see is that there's a difference between understanding causes and between specifying causes and understanding people. If our task as historian is to produce a kind of causal history, then I think we are bound by honesty and by the rules of our discipline to look for causes that are this worldly causes and not look beyond them. We don't explain things as historians by divine intervention. But if our task, in addition, is to understand what people were thinking, including many people right now are thinking, we had better understand what they think about divine intervention, because it's real to them. It's certainly real in this country. I believe it's real in your country as well.
Thank you. Thanks.
Are there any more questions, Otri?
No.
Okay, so Dr. Curley, thank you very, very much. As Anisha said, Anisha Datta mentioned earlier that we never gave, in our schools, we never had the opportunity to study Mangal-Kabya in depth, or, they did not make it interesting enough. But we all grew up with the stories from Mangal-Kabya, Lahana, Khulona, and all this. So thank you very much for this interesting talk, and we're definitely going to read more about it. There is one correction I have to make. You thank me as Dr. Supriya Bhattacharya. I'm not.
Oh, sorry.
I don't have a doctorate. So.
My mistake.
Okay. I have one question. What was the name of the wife of Kalodom? Was such powerful lady, it seems.
Oh, she's an amazing woman, and she seems to have had legends all her own. Her name is Lokhe, L short A Khe, usually is the spelling.
Okay.
Yeah, and she is interesting in that text, because she's the only woman who combines being a very, very good mother with being a warrior.
Oh.
Lao Tse's own wives, his 4 wives, one of them becomes a mother, she cannot be a warrior. One of them, the last, becomes a warrior, but she cannot be a mother. And so you see the complete split for elite women of these 2 roles, whereas Lokhe, the Dom woman, combines them both with no problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you once again.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was really fun.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody for coming. And thank you, Tirthankar for moderating.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mandakranta.
Wonderful.
Are we leaving?
Yes.
All right.
We can end.
Talk to you soon.
Pardon? Talk to you soon. Yes. Good. So thanks again. I'm just, it was a great pleasure to do this, and I wish your series the best. And I will
It's our pleasure.
getting a tape of it.
Yes, we'll send it.
We'll do that definitely, for sure. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.